we know we're not exempt entities. Okay, we know we're not incorporated companies. You may have one, but you are not one. Okay, so the only other maybe variable is possibly is the legal representative. Now initially, what does our mind think? An executor of a will, a lawyer, and all this. So initially our mind would just exclude that, leaving us very frustrated and confused. So let's move on though and look at this word legal representative. It goes, legal representative of a taxpayer means a trustee in bankruptcy, checks most of us off the list, an assignee, a liquidator, curator. Here's the fourth one, or fifth one, a receiver of any kind. Now that is so broad, it actually leaves you wondering, could you have possibly been in a position where you're receiving something for this taxpayer? We haven't discussed who the taxpayer is yet. Okay? Or any other like person, administrating, winding up, controlling, or otherwise dealing in a representative or a fiduciary capacity with property that belongs or belonged to or that is or was held for the benefit of the taxpayer. Now think about that when we discussed personification, the creation of these artificial persons. When we discussed property rights. If your property, you cannot be deprived of your property without due process of law. Yet every 2 weeks somebody takes a big chunk off your check whether you like it or not. Okay, something sort of confusing there. So, when we look at this magic they have in law of creating these magical imaginary persons, and we look at this from this perspective, what if we were this legal representative? Okay, and what if they created this other artificial person called a taxpayer? Whose property is the Income Tax Act dealing with? The taxpayer's property. It says it right there. For property that belongs or was held for the benefit of the taxpayer. So even if we are the legal representative, it's not even our property or this legal representative's property. Thereby putting him in a trust relationship to make sure he does what the government wants him to do, because the statute that created this entity is the statute that his property can be acquired from with that property. So let's see if we can add some clarity to that. Here's one really important point. When is a natural person no longer recognized as a natural person? Okay? This comes out of the Dictionary of Canadian Law, Duclos and Neuse. It goes, individual. So as we said, 80% of the time individual means a natural person when you read it in statutes and it's undefined. Okay? But the second one has some really good qualifiers in it. It goes, a natural person, that's what an individual is, but does not include a natural person in the capacity of a trustee, executive, administrator, or other legal representative. So, if we go back, we as a human being can act in law, be one human being, but two persons. Here we are as a human being in law called a natural person. Here we are acting in a different capacity as a legal representative. Guess what this legal representative doesn't have? That you have. Human rights and fundamental freedoms. Here's the big clue, because it's not human. So it doesn't need it. And maybe if we've been living out our lives representing these artificial persons that they've created, it's really developed an entrenched feeling that we have no rights. No, we have rights when we know who we are. We just don't have, these guys just don't have rights. And if we don't know we're representing them, it can get very frustrating. So in law, a legal representative does not have rights because it's not recognized as a natural person. So let's move on and look at this concept of capacity, because that's what all this is. You see, all we all started here with was what? One human being. It's amazing how powerful you are. They know who you are in this legal system. And the one thing they make sure is they will never tell you who you are, because if we ever found out who we really were in this legal system, guess what would happen to their game? They'd have to pack it up and leave town. Okay? It's because when we look at this whole complex illusion they created, we're just a human being. It's recognized in law with a natural person that has human rights that shall be recognized and protected. But unbeknownst to us, knowingly or unknowingly, we can act in phenomenal capacities, different capacities. I believe the Supreme Court in 1950 said the individual has unlimited capacities. Okay? Now, when we're in there, we need to really understand where this division of this is, especially as it relates to property rights. You see, what we have here is what we call direct personification, where you immediately act as a legal representative. Relative to property rights, this is why when you have a house or you have a car, they want you to register it, right? Well, that's a direct personification element because the property is tangible. Okay, there's your car, there's your house. You say, hey, for the benefit, I'll represent the entity as defined in that act. It could be a homeowner, it could be a driver, whatever it is, it's a different entity. Okay, so that's called direct personification. But the income tax game was a really much more complex one for one reason, is your right to your labor is your property. But your labor, unlike your house and your car, is intangible. So they couldn't do a direct personification relative to your labor. So they had to do for many reasons, and here's one, a more elaborate development of that. Okay, it often happens that we read this first part already. It often happens that a single human being possesses a double personality. He is one man but two persons. Now making a little bit more sense? Okay, in one capacity or in one right, as English lawyers say, he may have legal relations with himself in other capacities. And that's usually your, your direct personification. He owns the house, this artificial, but you get to live in it. And elements like that. Okay? Really, if the artificial person owned the car, you legally can't drive it. Because the rules say only one of these guys can drive it. Okay? Every contract, but this is where it gets really interesting, and the power of understanding this becomes amazing when we can actually see the simplicity of it. It goes, he may contract with himself, or owe money to himself, or transfer property to himself. So as much as we as a natural person, guess what we did? We transferred our private property over to some entity, subjecting it to the rules and regulations. Well, how do you undo that? With the same right you used to do it. Okay? Every contract, debt, obligation, assignment requires two persons. But those two persons may be the same human being. I know this, people may start looking at you funny when you start talking to yourself. But if you can get over that, you regain a lot of freedom back into your life. Okay? This double personality exists chiefly in the case of trusteeships. A trustee is, as we have seen, a person in whom the property of another is nominally vested to the intent that he may represent the other in the management and protection of it. So, all this stuff, income tax is on his property, it's on his income, it's not even on this artificial person's property or income, because the income tax is only subject to the entity that was created for. Okay, you just happen to be in a position where you're obligated to perform fiduciary representative capacity, to act in that capacity, to perform some duties for him. Primarily because he has no arms, ears, legs, or anything. He's just a figment of their imagination. Okay, but the one thing it cannot be you. Because you have property rights which they cannot touch. And that's why we keep getting these little stories. Oh, there's no property rights. There's actually one of our associates who lives out in Saskatchewan, and I don't know the minister exactly. It was one of the ministers, I believe it was the Minister of Justice there. He was the NDP critic for once, and I guess he's in now. He was talking to our associate, and he goes, well, no, you haven't had property rights since 1982. Because why? Because they're not mentioned. So they trained us that, think about it, if we did not know that there was this whole world of unwritten law, of predominant legislation, of rights that didn't need, see, think about it, when the government writes rights down, that means they granted them to you. You will never find a complete list of your natural rights written down in law. Why? Government never gave them to you. They existed before law. Okay? So here's this little structure they created, and there's many reasons for it. One is a logistic element. They can't get your property. So here's the logical reality to look at this from a level of predominance legislation. It goes 15.1 of the Charter. Remember that definition where it says it only applies to a natural person. So let's look at this from a logical perspective. 15.1 says, every individual is equal before and under the law, and has the right to equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination, and in particular it lists off some specific disadvantages and disabilities. Okay, now let's look at this. Probably many of you have seen this if you are unfamiliar with who you were. It's the Schedule 1 of the Federal Tax on Income. It's the 2007 version. Now, look at these in conjunction. Here we have a guaranteed right of equality without discrimination or anything. Look at the Schedule 1 from your tax returns. 15% if you make this much, 22% if you make that much, 26% if you make that much, and 29%